a different topic. And as I always say, if you're interested in giving a seminar, just contact Vinay. He does a really great job of organizing these seminars. And so today, I'm really, really happy to welcome my good friend and colleague, Arlene Johnson. Arlene and I were in graduate school together at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and spent a lot of really great time together as we went through getting our masters and PhDs. So that's always a very unforgettable and formative experience. And Arlene has gone on to do some really amazing work, I can say around the world, with conservation, and really taking a lead in conservation work in Lao PDR and many other countries. And she's been able to take her experiences and apply them to a lot of different conservation scenarios. And she had recently contacted me about potentially talking about these issues of working or collaborating with international researchers, and, if I can say, local researchers. And I think, as all of you know, here working in Rwanda, this is really a big issue, something that we think about all the time in the center, and how we develop authentic, real research partnerships that help to create real collaborations and benefit both parties. And so I'm just really, really excited that Arlene agreed to give us a talk today, because I know this is also something that we think about, many of our researchers think about very often. And so, Arlene, just so you know, in the group today, we have, I can see it's right today, mostly our researchers here at the center, and then many of our partners in NGOs and different organizations like Drew here from African Parks, and we have some other people from other NGOs in the country. We often have other partners from both international research collaborators who join. So we often have people from a lot of different countries here as well. So maybe they'll be joining in a little bit, but just so you know a little bit about who the audience is. So now I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to turn off my video and mute, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And then just reminding people at the end, you're welcome to put questions and comments in the chat, and you can also unmute and talk directly with Arlene after the talk. So thanks so much, Arlene.
Okay, thanks so much, Beth. It's an honor to be here with you all today, and thank you so much for this invitation to speak with you. I'm very excited to get to know you. I've heard about your center for a long time, so it's really a thrill for me to finally meet some of you and be able to talk with you today. So, okay, I am going to turn off my camera as well, and I'm going to share my presentation so we can take a look at that. Okay, there's sharing. I'm going to turn off my video here. Okay, let's see that that will share. Let's see. Why isn't that sharing? Okay, let's just cancel out of that. Turn off my video here. Okay, my entire screen, yes. Okay. Let's see if you're seeing that now. Pressing share. There we go. Oh yeah, should be okay now. Okay. Yeah, okay. I'm showing my screen now with the presentation. Then thank you so much for helping me organize all of this. Can you just confirm that you can see the screen all right and hear me all right?
Yeah, I can see it.
Looks great. Yeah.
Okay, super. Okay, thanks so much. Okay, so as Beth mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about some work we've done in Laos and Southeast Asia about structuring international partnerships that are aimed at both building research but also professional capacity for conservation in the country over the last 20 years or so. So as I want to start, you did receive my bio, but I want to just reiterate my background. So as Beth said, Beth and I met in graduate school at the UW-Madison. We shared the same advisor, and I learned a lot from Beth and her colleagues being part of that lab. And after finishing my PhD, I went on to work with the Wildlife Conservation Society for many years, and primarily lived in Asia for most of that time. I worked as the country director in Papua New Guinea, and then for many years in Laos in Southeast Asia. And this is a picture of our team in Laos at some point during those years when my husband and I worked there. When I finished up working with the Wildlife Conservation Society about 10 years ago, and moved back to the US, and I started working for an organization called Foundations of Success. And in that position, I provided technical support to projects all over Asia and various countries, also in parts of Africa and in the US, on using systematic methods, the conservation standards, for designing, monitoring, and evaluating their projects. And that was a great experience to work with so many different projects and programs around the world. And I still do some work with them, but primarily now I teach at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as an adjunct faculty here, and I teach in the Environmental Conservation Master's Program. This is an example of some of our students. I teach conservation planning courses for them, and they are students who are seeking training to go out and lead or direct conservation projects and programs. So really an exciting group to work with. So today in this presentation, I'm going to talk specifically about our work in Laos, but the need for research partnerships and conservation, as Beth talked about in her introduction. So I'll give a little overview of an international research partnership strategy that we set up in Laos with the intent to increase research results in the country, but also build national capacity there for conservation science and practice. And then we'll wrap up with a summary and some questions and discussions, and some questions I have for you as well, and look forward to hear your questions or thoughts on this topic. So, as we know, tropical ecosystems host much of the globe's biodiversity, and much of this biodiversity is in lesser developed countries where there's not a lot of resources frequently to manage or protect that biodiversity. So in these places, there's really an urgent need for increased biodiversity conservation and management, both capacity and resources. So as I said, most of my presentation today will deal with Laos in Southeast Asia. And here you see a map of Southeast Asia and the position of Laos in that, in the Indo-Chinese peninsula. And here we really face, as in many tropical countries, but especially in Southeast Asia, a really severe conservation crisis. There is a huge amount of illegal hunting and trade of wildlife from this region of the world, and as well as habitat loss and fragmentation. So there's been a lot of effort in Laos and this region to try to control and manage the illegal hunting and trade that goes on in this region. This is just an example of how severe the problem is here. Laos is a source country for wildlife as well as timber. And you can see how its proximity to Thailand, Vietnam, and China, there is a lot of porous borders and a lot of trade, illegal trade that goes on from the country. So it's a huge problem for a country that has really limited resources to address that. So in Laos, as in many other countries, there's really a need for partnerships between researchers and practitioners. And this is essential for diagnosing conservation problems, what's really happening, what is the problem, and then using that research results to determine what actions can be put in place to address the problem and achieve the desired outcomes. So in Laos, these partnerships this situation has required partnerships between a lot of foreign researchers and national scientists, because the national capacity for science has been limited, is increasing rapidly, but was limited, especially in the early days when we were working there in the early 2000s. And the intent of that partnership is not only to produce research results that will guide conservation actions, but ultimately to result in building national capacity to lead in conservation, ultimately taking over that research responsibility and the implementation of conservation practices in the country. And in the paper, we talk about how this is a step towards avoiding what's called parachute science, which is something that's been themed in the literature as foreign researchers working in a country, collecting data, maybe publishing that data, but not always building the capacity in the country to take over that work or acknowledging national counterparts. So our aim here was really to build that capacity in country as a result of these partnerships. So the question then we were debating was, how can international research partnerships be structured to improve conservation capacity and effectiveness in developing countries, especially because a lot of research, doesn't have a lot of extra resources for this. So how can we do that? So I'm going to be talking to you about an international research partnership strategy that we structured in Laos. And don't worry about this diagram on the left, I'll come back to it in more detail. But in short, we used 4 approaches to structure this partnership strategy, which was intended to build national capacity in conservation science and practice in the country. So this partnership was with academic institutions inside and outside of Laos, and I'll provide more details on that, as well as implementing institutions, government agencies, and any conservation organizations that were working in Laos. And our collective aim was to then strengthen national capacity to be able to design and implement effective conservation strategies, and then that would ultimately reduce threats to biodiversity and conserve that biodiversity. So as we go through this presentation, I'd like to also formulate some questions for you that we'll come back to at the end. I'm really wondering, are you or others using any of these approaches in Rwanda, or with perhaps neighboring countries, given some of your skills in Rwanda, reaching out to neighboring countries to strengthen national research capacity to address conservation problems? And if so, how are these approaches working? Are they similar to what we tried in Laos? Have you had successes, or what are the challenges or recommendations for improvement? So we'll come back to this at the end. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about Laos and our international research partnership strategy there. So Laos is, as we see on the map, located in the Indo-Chinese Peninsula in Southeast Asia. It's a landlocked country. Relative to Rwanda, it's 9 times the size of Rwanda. So just to give you an idea of the size of the country, but it only has 7.5 million people today. And so it's relatively low human population density compared to the neighboring countries like Vietnam and China and Thailand. And as a result, there's still a fair bit of primary forest cover in the country, about 17%, which is the highest in the region, but still plenty of challenges with habitat loss and fragmentation. So just to give you a picture of what Laos looks like, there's kind of 3 regions. Here along the western border, we have the enormous Mekong River and the Mekong lowlands, largely lowland dipterocarp forests, but much of this now has been transformed into agriculture of some sort. And then up here in the highlands, bordering Vietnam and China, also Myanmar, is the Northern Highlands, which are a very mountainous part of the country, almost getting into subtropical regions. And then along the eastern border here with Vietnam are the Annamite mountain range. And the Annamite Mountains are a isolated mountain range, and you may have heard of it as a very unique part of this region with a lot of endemism, a lot of unique animals and plants that aren't found in other parts of the world. For example, this is a picture of a sao la. This is the most recent discovery of the large mammal in the world. Was only discovered in the about 30 years ago with camera trapping in the region. So pretty unique. As far as protected areas in Laos, the system of protected areas in Laos is really very young compared to neighboring countries. The protected area system was established in 1993, and as you can see in this map on the right-hand side, there's up to 25 protected areas in the country now, but many of these protected areas really have limited management. And one of the reasons we found when we started working in Laos in the early 2000s was that most protected area managers had very limited training in conservation science and practice, or there was limited budget for them. They primarily had a background in very, traditional foundational skills, biology, chemistry, lab skills, forestry was a practice that was in the country, but nothing really in protected area management and conservation. At the same time, the National University of Laos, which was responsible for training people working in protected areas and conservation or doing research, was also relatively young. There was a forestry college originally, but the National University was only established in 1995, and that was just with undergraduate programs. And so about the same time that the protected area system was being set up. And then graduate programs only began in 2006, and actually very few of the faculty, even at that time, had advanced graduate degrees. So there were really few opportunities for students at the university to get involved in any type of field research. So in 2003, when I was working in with WCS in Laos, we established what was called the Biodiversity Conservation Project. And it was a partnership between the Wildlife Conservation Society and two faculties at the National University, the Faculty of Forestry and the Faculty of Science. And our collective goal was to improve the capacity of the faculty and the students in principles and practices of biodiversity conservation so that they could be producing graduates who could work in the protected area system, who could conduct research that was needed to address conservation problems. So a little bit about the Wildlife Conservation Society in Laos. The organization had been in Laos since 1993, and originally it was a lot of foreign scientists who came in to conduct wildlife and habitat surveys as they were trying to design the protected area system. And there were really very few national biologists to even work with on those surveys. And the surveys found that indeed the country was really rich in wildlife, but there was a lot of threats to these resources as far as ecosystems, and that really needed management. So when we started working in Laos in the late 90s, the government of Laos requested WCS to work more, do less surveys, but to build local capacity for research and conservation as part of our work in the country in protected areas and surveys. So let me tell you a little bit more about that strategy and its impact on national capacity, and kind of what we did to try to address the government's request. So we implemented 4 approaches as part of that agreement with the National University of Laos that started in 2003. The first thing, the most basic thing, was to support some undergraduate research projects. As I mentioned, there were really very few opportunities for what were only undergraduates at the time at the university to engage in any field research and learn about conservation science. And so we wanted to provide those opportunities for undergraduates so they could work with our WCS scientists on ongoing projects that we were working on in the new National Protected Area System. So this little diagram just shows our theory of change for that work. Our assumption was that if we mentored undergraduate research projects, that then those graduates at the National University of Laos would have increased research capacity. And when they graduated, they would be able to go out and work in government agencies or in conservation organizations, primarily international NGOs working in the country, who needed staff to support the government of Laos in their protected area system. And if that was in place, our assumption was that there would be more effective conservation strategies implemented that would reduce threats to biodiversity and conserve biodiversity in the country. So this partnership then regarding undergraduate research projects was, here were the kind of the details of it. WCS would provided support for final year students from those two faculties at the National University. Only 2 students from each faculty was what we were able to support each year. But the students then, as their final thesis for their final year of their undergraduate work, would conduct research to generate information that the protected area managers needed to better understand some of the conservation problems they were facing in the protected area and help them design a conservation solution. So WCS provided support for the students and the faculty supervisors to design the studies, provide the classroom and field training in the research methods, and logistical support to get out to the field and do the work. And we also mentored the students in basic data entry, basic analytical skills, and literature review. And this image here just shows one of the faculty here on the right at the National University in the field working with some of the students that we were supporting and our WCS staff. So the results of this approach were that over the years, we had about 50 students complete about 25 different studies in protected areas. And this was really exciting because students were able to provide some basic information on distribution and abundance of key species and ecosystems, help with some land use mapping, understanding some of the threats, or even the use of NTFPs like wildlife by communities around those protected areas. Some very useful products came out of those short research projects. And the pathways then that we hope to see were pretty successful with this approach, in that we saw about 1/3 of those graduates went on to work with the government of Laos, either in their natural resource management agencies like the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, Department of Forestry in protected areas, or as educators. And then about 1/3 of the students we actually hired to work with WCS after graduation, because we really needed national staff to work on projects that were ongoing research and protected area projects. And we found when we look back at this, when we published this paper in 2020, oh, sorry, was there a question there? Oh, okay, heard some noise. Hope everything's coming across okay. Okay, when we look back at this in 2020, we found that over 25% of these undergraduates that had gone through the undergraduate research program were at least 25% were still working in conservation or in some aspect of academia in Laos today. So the second approach that we put into place as part of this partnership was we thought we'd also try to support graduate research projects, because as I mentioned, in 2006, the National University in Laos began to offer graduate degrees. But even at that time, only 1/3 of the faculty had postgraduate degrees themselves. And so the graduate students really needed technical support and resources from international agencies and scientists to implement research projects. At the same time, the government allow is very restrictive about foreign researchers working in the country. And a lot of this is the result of the Vietnam War, which took place in Laos in the 60s and 70s, where there was since that time, there's been a lot of suspicion of foreigners working in remote areas in the country. And so if you were a foreign scientist, you really needed permission to conduct research in the country. And the requirement was that you had to work with a Lao student to implement your research, and a international NGO who had a memorandum of agreement to be able to work in the country. So it was very hard for foreign scientists to conduct research in the country. And as such, it turned out to be a good collaboration to couple them, these foreign researchers, anybody who wanted to work in the country, with a Lao graduate student so that they could both conduct research together. So back to our theory of change, then, this was very similar theory of change as our undergraduate research project, was that, again, it would increase capacity of graduates coming out of the university. So there would be more of that capacity to work in the implementing institutions in the country. Okay, so a little bit more then about this partnership. The objectives, as I mentioned, were to support Lao graduate research in ecology and biodiversity, and then that these results would be published, obviously for the benefit of both the scientific and the conservation community. And as I mentioned, the requirements were that the international researcher coming in provide mentoring and financial support for the national student, for the Lao student, to complete their master's research at the national university. And that documents that came out of that research would be prepared jointly, acknowledging collaboration of everyone involved. So our results were we only had 5 students complete master's degrees at the National University, and they were supported by 3 different academic and research institutions in the US. But it did provide new information on a number of threatened fish, reptiles, and mammals, and it did result in some peer-reviewed publications. And what came out of this approach was we did have 2 students eventually complete PhDs, and they actually now work on the National University of Lao faculty in the Faculty of Science. And the others are working with the government of Lao or in conservation NGOs in the country. And our main challenge was we had really hoped there would be more graduates going through this program, but we found it was that our international researchers said it was really difficult for them to obtain funding to support a master's student research project in the country. And it did take a long time for them to get permission to work in the country. And so there were some barriers to making this a really successful approach. Now I'd like to go on to the third approach, the third of the 4 approaches that we used. And this was really working on the curriculum at the National University with these 2 faculties. We found that the faculties really didn't have much ability to train in conservation because they didn't have very current or usable teaching materials or financial resources to purchase those. So a lot of their materials were outdated. They were in a language that was inaccessible. A lot of the students only spoke Lao, and many of the teachers as well, the instructors, the professors, or they were really expensive. And so that was really hampering their ability to teach biodiversity conservation principles. And we thought, well, this would be a critical first step towards institutionalizing professional capacity, the basic training at the university. So again, back to our theory of change. Our theory of change here was that if we enhance that biodiversity conservation curriculum in the National University, that the academic faculty would have increased research and professional capacity, and that would allow them to do a better job of training those individuals who are working in the implementing organizations. And another part of this approach was that those faculty would deliver in-service trainings for protected area staff as well. So if people had already graduated and didn't have these skills, we supported them to go out to protected areas and actually do in-service trainings. And that was done in partnership with our WCS staff, supporting them in that role. Okay, so a little more details on that partnership. These same two faculties then, along with WCS, we partnered with the network of conservation educators and practitioners at the American Museum of Natural History. And Beth, you will remember that this was a key initiative of Eleanor Sterling's when she was at AMNH and the Center for Biodiversity there. And so we partnered with them on this project to develop curriculum at the National University for training students in biodiversity research and conservation. And so trying to produce, the materials were produced in Lao language, and you'll see a picture of some of the materials here included, a synthesis on a key concept on a particular topic. It included a slide presentations, practical exercises for lab or in the field, exercise solutions, and teaching notes for the instructor. And then we also did faculty workshops, training the faculty in these materials, and then also interactive teaching techniques, because we found a lot of the teaching techniques were very much, because there weren't a lot of materials, just a lot of rote memorization. And so this was aimed at making that a little bit more interactive. Okay, so what resulted from this then was 17 modules on various topics, and all the professors were in those two faculties were trained, and you see a picture of one of these workshops here. These are an example of some of the topics in some of the modules. So everything from monitoring and adaptive management to threats to biodiversity, applied demography, a range of topics, and there were more beyond this. And so going back to our theory of change then, we did find this worked pretty well, that the professors did acquire increased capacity to use these modules to train undergrad and graduate students, and that they were used by the faculty and our WCS staff to do those in-service trainings for many of the national protected areas in the country. And this also resulted in a post-grad certificate course at the university in biodiversity conservation and protected area management. Okay, then close to wrapping up here, here was our fourth approach, which was basic in-service training and studies abroad. As I mentioned, when the protected area system was established, there was really only a handful of conservation practitioners in Laos with graduate degrees, and there were none with PhDs in conservation sciences, really only in forestry. So the fourth approach then, when we, in this agreement with the National University, was to actually hire graduates and do on-the-job training with FOS or with WCS and mentoring, and then where it was appropriate, provide support for studies abroad. So our theory of change here then was by employing and mentoring graduates actually at WCS, we would build their capacity, some of them going on to work with government eventually or other organizations, and that by supporting graduate studies, these graduates that were studying abroad at universities outside of Laos would come back, work at the National University or in implementing organizations back in the country. And so this partnership then really included on-the-job training with these graduates that were hired to work with WCS. They were mentored to attend and present research at regional and international meetings and participate in regional and international trainings to advance technical skills that they needed for their job, and where appropriate, for some of these staff to engage in graduate studies abroad. And so our results here were, in the first 10 years of this program, we had 48 staff employed to work with WCS research and conservation projects. And about 35% of these, a third of these, came to WCS after they had completed that undergraduate research project. And then 26 of these, almost half, were supported by WCS to complete some level of graduate studies abroad. And back to our theory of change then, we found when we look back on this in 2020 that half of these staff had remained with WCS for at least 5 years, and that the majority of these continue to work in conservation in Laos today. And it's really inspirational when I go back to Laos today for intermittent work to see so many of them as leaders in NGOs or in government departments or heads of protected areas. So it's been exciting to see how far they've come, and a few of them actually on the faculty now at the National University of Laos. So, and what was really rewarding was to see that those that were supported by WCS to complete graduate studies abroad have all returned to work in some capacity in conservation in Laos. Okay, wrapping up then. Just in summary, we can see, over the last 20 years, professional capacity for biodiversity conservation in Laos has made a lot of strides since those early days, with very few people with in graduate degrees of any support or any sort, or even the faculty having much background in conservation science. And we found that building this capacity really did work well if there was a combination of applied field work along with academic studies and on-the-job training to really provide people with the skills they needed to perform these tasks. So collaboration with international scientists and organizations, of course, is still ongoing in Laos. But today we see that Lao nationals are much more in the lead of those organizations, with appropriate support from international scientists and organizations, which has been a great result to see. So I'm going to stop there and see if you have any questions for me, and also come back to those questions for you all. If you've used these approaches or others in Rwanda or neighboring countries to strengthen national research capacity, clearly your center is a great example of this, and how those approaches are working. What have you seen as successes and challenges, and any recommendations for improvement? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and just go back over here and put on my camera.
Wow, thank you so much, Arlene. I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of everyone here. That was really, really interesting, and it's really great to see a quantification of how we do this work of building research capacity. So I would love to open it up to people here in the audience. Any of you, I know there's students here and researchers, more senior researchers. We have a big range here. Feel free to put a comment in the chat or raise your hand and ask a question directly. While we're waiting for a question, I wanted to comment. It's really impressive that an international NGO has taken up that initiative, like what you showed for Laos and WCS role. And it would be really great to see that more commonly. I do think it's happening in different places. And I was sort of reflecting on what is it different here. And for us in the center, when I say here, and it's in Rwanda and then also in the center, is that there's the initiative to build strong research partnerships from the side of the host country, if I can put it that way. So how do we if one way to put it would be, how do we convince the international researchers to engage in this true partnership? We're very lucky that we do have organizations here who do work with a lot of international researchers that are very collaborative. So an example is the Diane Fossey Gorilla Fund, and they are very, very collaborative and have done a lot of support for students. Also, African Parks has been a really great partner. So when we work with collaborative research, they very put front and center the importance of those international research partnerships. But then it also gets down to, what do those partnerships actually look like? And that's where also I heard you mention some of the researchers saying something about time and money. And yeah, that's really something. Now I've been convinced that, if we really want to make this change, yes, it's not going to be easy. And it is going to take time and money, but we have to commit to it if we really want to see that change happen. And I know that there are some researchers here who have had some different experiences. I don't know if anybody is here. I was thinking Mapendo, but I think he's not here. Yeah, anybody else who'd like to unmute and ask a question or make a comment or talk about any of your responses to Arlene's questions?
Hi, Beth.
That she left us with? Oh, there, good, you're there.
Oh, good.
I just want to mention that I'm around.
Good. Well, I thought of you because I think you're a really good example of on the cusp of being, the expert in Rwanda in amphibians, and he's working with research partners who are, if I can say, variably collaborative. And I don't need to necessarily target any authors, but just to say it's pretty shocking in the 21st century to still see papers come out about new species in a country without any national authors, while at the same time we know that there are national authors in the country doing that work, who they're even partnering with, who they're not co-authoring with. So maybe you could say there's a fine line between gift authoring versus, but I mean, that's the whole point, isn't it, of making real partnerships, so that if you're working with people who you feel aren't up to speed, you work with them so they get to that place where they do co-author. And having co-authorships at that stage is extremely important for people who are, moving up in their careers. So it's really incredibly frustrating to see this is still happening. I'm going to mute so that you others can talk.
But thank you for that summary. Mapendo, what's been your experience with this?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for bringing your presentation aboard. When I read the title, I was like, this comes in the right time. I have to shout out to the world about what is going on with people, especially international partners who really do research in our countries in Rwanda, and then they don't really fill the exact gap which should be there, like supporting these young researchers who are emerging from these developing countries. I will share a little bit of my experience. I'm happy that Beth is here, and she has been our mother in science to help us throughout. Recently, I was chatting with Professor Beth to explain the anxiety and also the demotivation, if I can say, working with international partners who really pretend helping us, and yet they simply throw us in a big ocean, and then you realize you are selling yourself inside that big ocean, and you don't know how to come out of that. I've been working on amphibians of Rwanda since around 5 years ago, and have been, let me say, the only Rwandan who is really motivated to working only on that taxon group. And my international partners have started showing interest in me since they found out that really I am keen on working on this group, which they have been investing in a lot of effort since 2009. And I was really surprised to see how this progress has been a little bit demotivating, seeing how I have been really working so much time and hard, even investing some of my resources towards having this science known in Rwanda. Trust me, it was difficult for the Rwanda Environmental Management Authority to include even amphibians in the reports, the numbers, diversity and distribution. And this was because of different community engagement with students and other people whom I have really spoke a lot about amphibians of the country, yet those international partners have ever been there. So it means all their publications were just online, but not brought on table of discussions for policy and other decisions. And when I realized that working without being recognized brought to me another sense of thinking, not cutting the chain between me and international partners, but growing up and thinking otherwise. Because I believe that the little knowledge I have already gained can be a big stepping stone toward doing something else in terms of amphibian studies in Rwanda, without always relying upon those partners. I don't want to say international partners, because we still have to collaborate, but it has been really very sad. There is a paper which was published recently, and I remember originally I had the same idea which I explained to them, and I was discouraged that there is nothing innovative in that paper. Yet I spent a lot of time doing different literature review, collecting all the information, and develop a checklist, at least a checklist for the amphibians of Rwanda. And surprisingly, it is of recent that I realized the paper was published by them. They developed, of course, a lot of literature, but with the same idea. And I wasn't even co-authored. Trust me, I felt so much embarrassed, but this gave me another sense of growing up, that I don't really have to rely always on people, taking the little I have and assure that I really use this stepping stone and continue to work toward amphibians of Rwanda. I'm Rwandan, I'm enthusiastic, I'm still young, I'm part of the academic world. I have Professor Beth always mentoring us, so I have big hope that now we can be self-reliant and do something, not always accusing the Western world, but also growing up like African scientists who are really able to be the first authors on the papers and bring science on the table without waiting people to do the work for us. That's my little experience so far. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mapendo, for sharing that experience. And I'm sorry to hear about you not being included as an author on some of those key papers. But yeah, we do still see this problem. And as Beth said, some organizations and researchers are much better than others at seeing the need and the value to honor those national counterparts that are contributing so much. I'm wondering, well, congratulations to you, Mapendo, for seeing the way through this and saying, I can formulate this research and bring in collaborators to support me, but I being the lead on that. And I think you're seeing that more. I'm wondering, one of the things that really motivated this in Laos was that because the government, for better or for worse, is because of the whole Vietnam War experience, is very suspicious of, foreigners in the country. They are very careful about who works in the country and how they work and how involved, how much they involve nationals is very much required. Is there an institution that oversees the research? If a foreign scientist wants to do research in Rwanda, is there a research institute that they have to get permission through? And would it be possible through that institution to better formulate, guidance on working with and acknowledging building the capacity of scientists in the country? Does that exist? I know we had something like that in Papua New Guinea that sort of monitored that or refereed those relationships.
Yeah, the park, it's the like the park authority, and all incoming researchers who want to work in the national parks have to complete an application to work with them. So we have been working with them for quite a few months to try to integrate into that research permit application statements about the need to work with the center so that, for example, specimens are kept, because sometimes they leave specimens, but for example, the park authority doesn't have the appropriate way to maintain them. And then the National Herbarium has the climate controlled space, et cetera. So we're still working with them to make that link. And then also, if you do research in any of the national parks that are managed by African parks, then they also have a permit, which is very explicit about working with local partners as well. And then, but again, the nature of that relationship, because, you could say Mapendo's been collaborating for a while, but still, and mandating, and we've even tried, in the document we are working with the park authority is really to lay out the nature of that relationship and the importance of the collaboration and the process of publication, for example. And the other thing is, if you come into the country to do research, but not in a national park, you go through a different agency. And we also are trying to have a better connection there so that, again, the researchers don't just come in, as what you mentioned, this parachute science model, and then go out. So there are still some loopholes where that can still happen. But even with some of the partners we have in the center, where we have tried to make it really clear, we've found hesitancy for researchers to even sign agreements about clarity on the nature of the relationship. For example, when new species are found, that they will work hand in hand with the Rwandan researchers on the identifications. People are really not happy to have to do that, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Especially since the long-term goal to conserve those species in Rwanda will require people like Mapendo and others leading that initiative in the country. So it's very short-sighted to think about it only identifying the species, but what about the long-term management?
Yeah, it's quite hard to understand. Another thing we've been trying to do is, you were talking about the student training, and we've also been trying to get universities that come and do study tours in Rwanda. There's quite a few from all kinds of universities, from really small liberal arts colleges all the way up to like Columbia and Yale. And many of them are very well funded and have a vehicle and go around and visit all the national parks. And we sometimes have trouble getting our students out into the field, and also the access to some of the top level officials that those students do. And so we also were asking those groups, can you collaborate and join with Rwandan students to have that experience in a multicultural experience, which I think would also be valuable. And that's also been a challenge to get organizations to accept and take that up, which has been interesting.
That is interesting, because I think that's obviously has been one of the most valuable outputs of that collaboration in Laos, is to have that partnership between, really the local actors and scientists in the country, which, as you can see, were very few at the beginning, and it was really necessary to have more local involvement to really understand what was going on with conservation and with research in the country. So
I shouldn't paint it as all negative, because as I mentioned in the beginning, we have a number of organizations here that are very collaborative, and we have a lot of really great international research partners. Like, we just did a course with a professor from Columbia University, and it was fully 50-50 Columbia University US students and Rwandan students. And, you know, that's what we hope eventually to attain, is that real 100% mix and experiential learning that can happen.
Fantastic. And it seems like one of my questions was, I mean, it seems like you have such a vibrant center there, and so many researchers involved in the country. Is Rwanda unusual in the region of Africa where you are? Do you find yourselves, do you have students coming in from other countries to the university in Rwanda, or are some of your work also strengthening national capacity in neighboring countries?
That's variable. We don't have so many international students. There are at the postgrad level. Some of the PhD programs and some master's programs have funding scholarships and attract international students. That is eventually the aim. The master's program was originally developed to be regional and international, and yeah, it takes time to build that up, but that is the hope. I think Rwanda is really well situated. I don't know if any of my other colleagues have comments on this. You're all so quiet today.
Right, everybody's got a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bennett.
Yeah, my comment from that question is that we also have a few international students from bachelor's level, and I can remember since the time I was in my bachelor, I started with 2 Burundian people, and recently there is someone from Nigeria who took a master's here in development studies. Yeah, to complement what Beth said, of course, it depends on the available fundings, and some center has those fundings to attract them, as she said, but not like, there is still few. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's exciting because it seems like your center really serves as a model for that.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, great. I wish you, it's been so lovely to meet you all today, and exciting to hear a bit about your work there in Rwanda. And I'm really impressed with what your center is doing, and really all the exciting work that's coming out. Despite a few challenges, it sounds like you're making great progress in your partnerships and capacity building and research in the country. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Arlene. I really appreciate it. And I shared the PDF with everybody in our WhatsApp group. But if anybody here wants a PDF, let me or Vinat know and we can get it to you. That's really inspiring. I really like the way you made this structure and then linked it to a theory of change. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and have a great afternoon and evening there in Rwanda. I'm sorry I'm not going to see you all in Kigali at the ICP meetings, but I hope you all attend and present.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and thanks, Arlene. We'll stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.